He believed nothing in that room could surprise him, until the smallest movement rewrote everything. The restaurant glowed in warm amber light, the kind that softened edges and made power look effortless, where a single dinner could cost more than a month's rent, and every whisper carried weight. Adrian Volkov sat at the center table, posture relaxed, fingers resting lightly against a crystal glass, his presence alone enough to quiet nearby conversations without a single word. People didn't look at him directly, they felt him, like a pressure in the air. Across the room, Nia Brooks moved between tables with practiced precision, her steps light, her expression neutral, invisible by design. She had learned early that invisibility kept you safe, kept you paid, kept you overlooked in places where people like her were expected to blend into the background like polished silverware. Tonight was supposed to be like every other shift. 8 hours, $12 an hour plus tips. Keep your head down, don't make mistakes. But something shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was subtle, like the temperature dropping a few degrees or a conversation cutting off half a second too soon. Nia noticed it before anyone else. 3 men entered, dressed well enough to belong, but their eyes didn't move like customers. They scanned, calculated, measured distances instead of menus. Nia's grip tightened around her tray, the weight suddenly heavier, her pulse picking up, not panic, not yet, just awareness. Around her, laughter continued, glasses clinked, a server dropped a fork somewhere near the bar, but the rhythm felt off, like a song playing slightly out of tune. Adrian didn't look up immediately, but something in his stillness changed, a subtle shift only someone watching closely would catch. He knew. Of course he knew. Power like his didn't get blindsided, it anticipated. Still, he didn't move. Not yet. One of the men stepped closer, his path too direct, too deliberate, and suddenly the space around Adrian felt smaller, tighter, like the walls had inched inward. Conversations faded. Chairs scraped softly as people sensed something they couldn't name. Nia's heart began to pound, steady and loud, each beat echoing in her ears at what felt like 120 beats a minute. She should step back. She should walk away. That's what everyone else was doing, retreating quietly, pretending not to see. But her feet didn't move, because she had felt this before. That same wrongness. That same moment where everything hangs on what someone chooses to do next. Her eyes flicked to Adrian's table. A single object sat within reach, unnoticed by most, but not by her. Not anymore. The distance between them was less than 6 feet, but it might as well have been a mile. Her fingers trembled slightly, her breath shallow, her mind racing through 1,000 reasons to stay out of it. This wasn't her world. These weren't her battles. But the silence that followed, the kind that presses against your chest and demands a decision, told her something else entirely. And in that silence, just before everything changed, Nia Brooks realized one thing with absolute clarity. Staying invisible was no longer an option. The air did not explode into chaos the way movies would suggest. It tightened, it narrowed, it pressed down on every chest in the room until even breathing felt like a decision that required permission. And in that fragile, suspended moment, the entire world seemed to pivot around a single table where Adrian Volkov sat without moving a single inch. His expression unchanged, his fingers still resting against the rim of his glass as if nothing had shifted, as if the presence closing in around him was merely an inconvenience rather than a threat. And that was what unsettled Nia the most. Not fear, not panic, but the absolute absence of either on his face. Because men who had something to lose reacted. They flinched, they negotiated, they looked for exits, but Adrian did none of that. He simply watched, and somehow that made everything more dangerous, because it meant he understood something no one else in that room did. And still, he remained exactly where he was, while the 3 men continued to move with quiet precision, spreading just enough to control the space without drawing attention from anyone who had not already noticed, their voices low, controlled, almost polite, but there was no mistaking the intention behind their presence. It was not about conversation, it was about control, and slowly, subtly, the entire restaurant adjusted to them. Conversations died mid-sentence. A woman near the window lowered her fork without realizing it. A bartender froze with a glass in his hand, and one by one, people began to step back, not running, not screaming, just creating distance. instinctively pulling themselves away from the center of gravity that had become Adrian's table. And through all of it, Nia remained where she was, her body rooted, her tray still in her hands, though she no longer felt its weight, because something else had taken over, something deeper than fear, something older than logic, a memory that rose uninvited, sharp and clear, of another room, another moment when something felt wrong and no one moved, when everyone chose silence because it was easier, safer, more acceptable. And she had told herself back then that if she ever felt that moment again, she would not be the one who stood still. But promises made in the past always felt different when they collided with the present, when the consequences became real, when the cost was no longer hypothetical. And now here she was, standing less than 10 feet away from a man who held the attention of an entire city without speaking, and 3 others who had come to challenge that without raising their voices. And the distance between action and inaction felt impossibly wide, her heart racing faster now, closer to 130 beats per minute, each pulse echoing in her ears, drowning out everything else, until even the soft clink of glass against wood sounded distant, unreal, like it belonged to another world entirely. And then Adrian moved, not much, just enough to shift his gaze, not toward the men surrounding him, but past them, beyond them, until for the briefest second, his eyes met hers. And it was not a plea, not a command, not even recognition, it was something quieter, something heavier, an acknowledgement of presence, as if he had always known she was there, as if invisibility had never applied to her in his world, and that single glance shattered the last barrier she had built around herself, because now she was no longer outside of it, no longer just a witness. She was part of the moment whether she wanted to be or not, and suddenly the question was no longer whether she should act, but whether she could live with herself if she did not, because the room had already made its choice. Everyone else had stepped back. Everyone else had decided that survival meant distance, meant silence, meant pretending this was not happening. And maybe that was the smart choice. Maybe that was the safe choice. But standing there, feeling the weight of that silence press against her, Nia understood something with absolute certainty. Safety had never protected anyone she had lost, and silence had never changed anything. And the longer she stood still, the heavier that truth became, until it settled in her chest like something that refused to be ignored. And without fully realizing it, her fingers loosened around the tray, letting it rest against the edge of a nearby table, her body shifting forward by an inch, then another, each step small, almost unnoticeable, but deliberate, closing a distance that most people in that room would never dare to cross. Her breathing steadying not because she was calm, but because she had already made the decision she had been trying to avoid. And somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the fear, beneath the doubt, one thought repeated itself with quiet, unwavering clarity. This time, she would not look away. The distance between her and that table felt like crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. And yet Nia kept moving, one measured step at a time, her shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor, as if even the ground understood the weight of what was about to happen. And around her, the room held its breath, not in panic, but in anticipation, like something unseen was unfolding that no one fully understood, but everyone could feel. And still the 3 men maintained their quiet control, their voices low, their presence calculated, guiding the moment without raising it into chaos, because chaos would invite attention and attention would complicate things, and they were not here for complications. They were here for certainty, for a controlled outcome, for a result that would leave no room for interruption. And yet, in that carefully constructed stillness, there was one variable they had not accounted for, one presence they had dismissed before it could even register, because invisibility has a way of being mistaken for insignificance, and Nia had lived her entire life inside that misunderstanding, moving through spaces where people looked past her, spoke over her, dismissed her without ever truly seeing her. And tonight had been no different, until now, because now every step she took carried weight. Every inch she closed between herself and Adrian's table shifted the balance of something larger than any of them could name. And she could feel it in the way the air changed, the way one of the men's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly, as if some instinct had begun to whisper that something was wrong, that something had entered the equation that did not belong. But by the time that awareness reached the surface, Nia was already close enough to see the details others would miss. The subtle tension in Adrian's jaw, the way his hand rested just slightly away from the object on the table, not reaching for it, not ignoring it, simply acknowledging its presence without claiming it, as if the choice to act had not yet been made, or perhaps had been deliberately withheld. And that realization struck her with unexpected force, because for the first time she understood that this was not a moment of helplessness. It was a moment of decision, one that Adrian had chosen not to take, and suddenly the weight of that choice shifted onto her, pressing against her chest with a clarity that left no room for hesitation. Because if he would not move, then someone had to, and the silence around them grew heavier, thicker, until even the smallest movement seemed amplified. The soft rustle of fabric, the faint scrape of a chair leg, the distant hum of the city beyond the glass walls fading into nothing as the world narrowed down to a single point in time, and Nia's breath steadied not because the fear had disappeared, but because it had been replaced by something stronger, something that refused to let her step back again. And in that moment, she was no longer the waitress carrying a tray, no longer the woman who kept her head down to survive. She was simply a person standing in front of a choice, and choices, she had learned, were the only things that ever truly defined who you were. And then Adrian's voice broke the silence, not loud, not urgent, but calm in a way that made it impossible to ignore, a single sentence spoken as if it carried no weight at all, yet somehow anchoring the entire room in place. And though the words were not directed at her, she felt them all the same, felt the intention behind them, the quiet acknowledgement that whatever came next would not be undone. And for the briefest second, their eyes met again. And this time there was something different there, not control, not detachment, but understanding, as if he recognized the decision forming in her before she fully realized it herself. And that recognition did not stop her. It did not warn her away. It simply confirmed what she already knew, that the moment had arrived, that the line had been crossed, and that there was no returning to who she had been before this night. And with that realization settling deep within her, Nia Brooks took one final step forward, her hand moving not with hesitation but with purpose, reaching toward the object that had remained untouched until now. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the balance of the entire room shifted in a way no one would ever forget. Time did not stop, but it stretched, pulling every second into something thin and fragile, as if the world itself was waiting to see whether she would follow through or fall back into the safety everyone else had already chosen. And Nia felt that stretch in her fingertips before anything else, the slight tremor that ran through them as her hand hovered inches above the cold surface of the table, close enough now to see the reflection of the overhead lights flickering across polished metal, close enough to feel the presence of every eye in the room without needing to look up, because attention has weight. And in that moment it pressed down on her shoulders like something physical, something undeniable. And yet she did not pull back. She did not hesitate, because hesitation had already cost her too much in a life where standing still meant losing something you could never get back. And this moment felt too familiar, too close to a memory she had tried to bury, a night years ago when everything had depended on someone making a choice and no one did, when silence had been louder than any scream and still nothing changed. And she had carried that silence with her ever since, carried it into every shift, every quiet step, every moment where she chose not to be seen, believing that invisibility was protection when in reality it had only been avoidance. And now that illusion cracked under the weight of what stood in front of her, because this was not just another shift, not just another table. This was a moment that demanded something more than survival. And as that realization settled, the trembling in her hand steadied, replaced by a focus so sharp it cut through the noise in her mind, narrowing everything down to a single action, a single point of contact. And when her fingers finally closed around the object resting on the table, the sensation was immediate and grounding, cool, solid, real, heavier than she expected, as if it carried the gravity of every decision that had ever been made with it. And for a fraction of a second, she became acutely aware of the impossibility of what she was doing, of how absurd it would look to anyone watching, a waitress stepping into a space she did not belong, crossing lines that had been invisible but absolute only moments before. And yet the room did not react the way logic said it should. No one shouted. No one lunged forward. Because the act itself was so unexpected, so outside the script everyone had unconsciously agreed to follow, that it created a pause. A gap in reality where nothing moved. And in that gap, Nia lifted her gaze, not to the men surrounding the table, not to the exits or the other staff frozen along the walls, but to Adrian. Because somewhere along the way this had stopped being about fear and started being about recognition, about the silent exchange that had passed between them twice now. And when their eyes met again, there was no surprise there, no confusion, only a quiet acknowledgement that settled something deep within her, as if he had anticipated this outcome long before she had, as if he had left the choice unclaimed because he knew someone else would take it. And that realization did not frighten her, it anchored her. Gave her something solid to stand on in a moment where everything else felt uncertain and behind her. She could feel the shift ripple through the room, subtle but undeniable, the kind of movement that does not come from action but from awareness, as if everyone present had suddenly realized that the balance had changed in a way they could not yet explain, and the men who had entered with such quiet confidence now carried a different tension, not panic, not even fear, but recalculation. Because control depends on predictability, and unpredictability had just entered the equation in the form of someone they had already dismissed. And in that recalculation, in that brief disruption of certainty, Nia found the final piece of what she needed, not courage, not strength, but clarity, the understanding that this was no longer about whether she belonged in this moment, but about what the moment required from her. And as her grip adjusted, firm but steady, her breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of her heartbeat as it settled into something controlled, something deliberate. And for the first time since she had taken that first step forward, the fear receded just enough to reveal what lay beneath it. Not confidence, but conviction, the kind that does not shout or demand attention, but simply exists, quiet and immovable. And in that stillness, surrounded by a room that had forgotten how to breathe, Nia Brooks made the choice she had been building toward from the second she felt something was wrong. And without raising her voice, without breaking the silence that had come to define the moment, she acted in a way that would change not only the outcome of this night, but the way every person in that room would remember what it meant to stand up when no one else would. The moment did not erupt the way anyone expected. It settled, like a decision finally landing after being suspended for too long. And in that quiet landing, everything shifted, not in sound, but in understanding, because the instant Nia acted, the illusion of control that had filled the room fractured without a single word needing to be raised, and the men who had entered with certainty now found themselves recalculating in real time. Their attention no longer fixed solely on Adrian, but divided, disrupted, pulled towards something they had never considered a factor, and that division, however slight, was enough to change the balance. Enough to open a space where none had existed before, and it was in that space that movement returned to the room, not chaotic, not explosive, but deliberate, controlled, like a current shifting direction beneath the surface. And Adrian, who had remained still through it all, finally moved, not with urgency, but with intention, rising from his seat in a way that did not rush the moment, but claimed it, his presence expanding to fill the silence that had held him in place seconds before. And for the first time, the focus of the room was no longer on what might happen, but on what had already changed, because something irreversible had taken place, something that could not be undone or ignored. And Nia felt that shift as clearly as anyone, standing there with her breath steadying, her hands no longer trembling, not because the situation had become safe, but because she had crossed the point where fear dictated her actions. And now there was only the aftermath of choice, the quiet weight of it settling into her chest as she became aware again of everything around her. The distant murmur of someone near the entrance, the faint hum of the city outside the glass, the subtle repositioning of staff and guests who had instinctively moved farther away but could not look away. Because moments like this did not allow for indifference, they demanded witness. And as that awareness spread, the men who had initiated the tension found themselves in unfamiliar territory, not defeated, not yet, but no longer in control, their earlier precision disrupted by something they could not easily categorize, because unpredictability does not follow rules, and without rules, strategy begins to falter, and in that falter, even the smallest shift becomes significant, and Adrian understood that better than anyone, his gaze moving not to assert dominance, not to challenge, but to acknowledge the new reality that had been created in seconds, and then, slowly, deliberately, his attention returned to Nia, not as a bystander, not as an employee, but as the person who had altered the course of what was meant to unfold, and there was no dramatic expression in his eyes, no visible reaction that would satisfy the expectations of those watching, only a quiet, measured recognition that carried more weight than any spoken praise, because in his world, recognition was not given lightly, and never without reason, and for Nia, that moment landed differently than anything that had come before, not as validation, not as relief, but as something deeper, something steadier, the realization that she was no longer invisible, not because someone had chosen to see her, but because she had stepped into a moment that could not ignore her, and that understanding grounded her in a way that fear never could, because it was not dependent on anyone else's perception. It was built on her own action, her own decision to step forward when stepping back would have been easier. And as the room slowly began to breathe again, as tension loosened just enough for sound to return in fragments, whispers, movements, the outline of what had happened began to take shape in the minds of everyone present, and though none of them would describe it the same way, they would all remember the same thing. The moment when someone they had not noticed changed everything without asking permission. And in the center of it all, Nia stood not as a hero, not as a symbol, but as a person who had made a choice, and in doing so, had redefined what was possible in a room where power had once seemed absolute. The room did not return to normal. It recalibrated, slowly, carefully, like a system adjusting to a new reality it had not been designed to handle. And in that recalibration, every person present seemed to understand, without needing to say it out loud, that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the outcome of the moment, but in the roles they had unconsciously assigned to one another, because power, when interrupted, does not disappear, it reveals what lies beneath it, and what lay beneath this moment was something no one had anticipated. And Nia could feel that revelation in the way the silence changed, no longer heavy with fear, but filled with something sharper, something observant, as if the room itself had begun to see differently, to reassess what it thought it understood about who mattered and who did not. And standing at the center of that shift, she became acutely aware of herself again, not as an idea, not as the person who had acted, but as Nia Brooks, a woman who still wore a simple uniform, who still had a shift that had started like any other, who still had a life waiting outside those glass walls, unchanged in every practical way, and yet completely altered in ways she could not yet measure. And that contrast settled into her chest with a quiet intensity, because moments like this did not rewrite your life in obvious ways. They changed the way you carried it, the way you moved through spaces, the way you understood your own presence. And for the first time in a long time, she did not feel the need to shrink herself to fit into the room. She simply stood, steady, aware, grounded in the decision she had made, and across from her, Adrian observed that shift with the same measured calm he had maintained from the beginning. But now there was something else layered beneath it, something more deliberate, as if he was not just watching what had happened, but considering what it meant, and that consideration held weight, because in his world, meaning translated into action, into consequences that extended far beyond the moment itself. And yet he did not rush to speak, did not fill the silence with declarations or commands, because silence, in the right hands, was more powerful than any immediate response, and instead, he allowed the room to settle, allowed the reality of what had occurred to take hold fully before he acknowledged it. And when he finally did move, it was not toward the men who had initiated the tension, not toward the exits or the staff who remained frozen along the edges, but toward Nia, each step unhurried, deliberate, the kind of movement that drew attention without demanding it. And as he closed the distance between them, the space seemed to shift once more, not with fear, but with focus. Because everyone understood that this was the true aftermath, not the moment itself, but what followed it. how it would be defined, how it would be remembered. And when he stopped in front of her, there was no dramatic pause, no visible display of emotion, only a stillness that mirrored her own. Two people standing in the center of a room that had forgotten how to look away, and for a brief second, nothing was said, because words, in that moment, would have reduced something that was larger than language, and instead, Adrian inclined his head just slightly, a gesture so small most would have missed it, but one that carried a significance far greater than any spoken acknowledgement, because it was not given lightly, not offered out of obligation, but earned through action, and in that gesture, the entire room understood something without needing it explained, that the person they had overlooked minutes ago now occupied a space that could not be ignored. And that realization settled into the atmosphere with a quiet finality, reshaping the way every eye in the room viewed her, not with pity, not with surprise, but with a recognition that felt both new and long overdue. And as that recognition spread, subtle but undeniable, Nia felt the last remnants of her old instinct fade, the urge to step back, to disappear, to return to the safety of being unseen. And in its place, there was something steadier, something that did not demand attention but no longer avoided it either. And in that balance, she found a new kind of strength, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable, the kind that does not need to prove itself because it has already acted when it mattered most. And though the night was far from over, though consequences would unfold in ways she could not yet predict, one thing had already been decided, something that could not be undone, that from this moment forward, the world around her would never quite look the same. Because once you step into a moment that demands courage and you answer it, you cannot return to a life where you pretend that you are invisible. What no one realized in that moment was that the most dangerous part had never been the men who walked in. It was what came after someone chose not to back down. Because power does not simply accept disruption, it studies it, tests it, decides what to do with it. And as the room slowly settled into this new, fragile balance, that unspoken tension returned, quieter now, but sharper, like a blade hidden beneath silk. And the men who had entered with quiet control had not disappeared, they had only adjusted, their posture more measured, their attention more focused, because unpredictability does not end a situation, it complicates it, and complicated situations demand careful response. And that response was forming even now, just beneath the surface, in the way one of them shifted his stance slightly, in the way another's gaze moved between Adrian and Nia with a calculation that had not been there before. And for the first time since she stepped forward, Nia felt the full weight of what she had done settle in, not as regret, not as fear, but as awareness, the understanding that moments like this do not end cleanly. They evolve, they stretch into something larger than the initial decision. And she was now part of that unfolding whether she wanted to be or not. And yet, even as that realization grounded itself in her, she did not step back. She did not return to the edges of the room where safety waited disguised as distance, because something inside her had already changed, too deeply to reverse. And across from her, Adrian seemed to recognize that shift not as a momentary reaction, but as something permanent, something that would not fade once the night ended. And that recognition altered his own posture almost imperceptibly. The way he stood now not just as a man reclaiming control, but as someone acknowledging a new variable that would not be ignored. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, carrying just enough weight to reach every corner of the room without needing to rise. A tone that did not demand attention, but commanded it all the same. And though the words were directed outward, meant to redefine the situation and bring it back into alignment, there was an undercurrent beneath them, something that acknowledged what had already happened and what it meant moving forward. And as those words settled into the space, the tension shifted once again, no longer centered on confrontation, but on resolution, on the quiet understanding that whatever had been intended when those men walked in had been altered beyond recovery, not through force, not through escalation, but through a single unexpected action that had broken the pattern they relied on. And patterns, once broken, are difficult to rebuild under pressure, and that truth now hung in the air, invisible but undeniable, guiding every movement that followed. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the room began to release the breath it had been holding, Conversations did not resume, not yet, but the stillness softened, the rigid lines of fear loosening into something more fluid, more uncertain, as people began to process what they had witnessed, and in that processing, their attention returned again and again to Nia, not with curiosity, not with disbelief, but with a quiet recognition that carried a different kind of weight, because they had all been there, all seen the moment where they chose not to act, and they had also seen what it looked like when someone did, and that contrast settled deeply, reshaping something internal that would follow them long after they left this place. And for Nia, standing at the center of that realization, the noise of the room faded once more, not because it had disappeared, but because her focus had shifted inward, toward the steady rhythm of her own breath, the grounding presence of her body, the undeniable truth that she had done something she once believed she never could, and in that awareness, there was no need for validation, no need for approval, only a quiet certainty that the person she had been at the beginning of this night no longer existed in the same way, and that whatever came next, whatever consequences or changes would follow, she would meet them differently, not as someone waiting to be overlooked, but as someone who had already stepped forward when it mattered most, and that difference, though invisible to some, was the most powerful shift of all. Respect is not given in moments of comfort. It is revealed in moments where everything is at risk. And as the room continued to settle into its fragile new balance, that truth began to take shape in a way no one could ignore, because what had happened was no longer just an interruption. It had become a statement, one that lingered in the air long after the immediate tension had softened. And the men who had once held control now stood at the edge of a decision they could not fully dictate. Their earlier certainty replaced by a measured restraint, not out of weakness, but out of recognition that the situation had evolved beyond their initial design, and that evolution carried consequences they had not prepared for, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to withdraw, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement that the moment no longer belonged to them. And as they stepped back, the invisible pressure that had gripped the room loosened further, allowing space for something else to emerge, something quieter but far more enduring, a shift in perception that could not be undone by simply leaving. And as the distance between them grew, Adrian remained exactly where he was, his presence still commanding, but now layered with something more introspective, as if he was not just observing the outcome, but measuring its significance, not in terms of power, but in terms of meaning. And that distinction mattered, because meaning has a way of altering future choices in ways power alone cannot. And when his gaze returned to Nia once more, it carried that weight fully, not as curiosity, not as surprise, but as a deliberate acknowledgement of what she had done and what it represented. And for a moment, the world seemed to narrow again, not in tension, but in clarity, as if everything else had faded just enough for that recognition to stand on its own. And in that space, without raising his voice, without drawing attention beyond what was already fixed upon them, Adrian spoke, his words measured, precise, carrying the kind of authority that did not need to be enforced because it was already understood, and though the sentence was simple, it landed with a weight that resonated through the room, not as praise, not as reward, but as truth, a truth that redefined how everyone present would remember this moment. And as those words settled, Nia felt something shift within her again, not the sharp clarity of decision, not the steady grounding of action, but something quieter, something that unfolded slowly, like a realization that had been waiting beneath the surface. And it was not about what she had done, but about what it meant to be seen, truly seen, not as a role, not as a background presence, but as a person whose choices carried weight. And that realization was both unfamiliar and undeniable, because for so long she had moved through spaces where her existence was acknowledged only in function, only in what she provided or completed, and now, standing in the same uniform, in the same place, nothing about her external reality had changed, and yet everything felt different, because perception had shifted, and perception, she realized, was not something given freely, it was something claimed, often in moments that demanded more than comfort allowed, and around them, the room absorbed that shift in its own way. Conversations did not immediately resume, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was reflective, filled with the quiet processing of what had just occurred, and though no one spoke it aloud, there was a shared understanding forming, a recognition that what they had witnessed was not just an event, but a lesson, one that would linger long after the night ended, because it challenged something fundamental. The assumption that power always dictates outcome, that position always determines value. And in that challenge, something new had been introduced, something that could not be easily categorized or dismissed. And as the final traces of tension dissolved into the ambient sounds of the restaurant slowly returning, the soft clink of glass, the distant murmur of voices regaining their rhythm, Nia stood in the center of it all, no longer trying to disappear into the background, no longer measuring her presence against the expectations of others, but simply existing within the space she had claimed through action. And though the future of this moment remained uncertain, though consequences and changes would unfold beyond what she could see, one truth had already been established, something that would not fade with time or distance, that dignity is not something others grant you. It is something you defend when the moment demands it, and in defending it, you do not just change the outcome of a single night, you change the way the world is forced to see you from that moment forward. What remained after everything else faded was not the tension, not the memory of who entered or why, but the silence that followed a truth no one could undo, the kind of silence that does not demand attention yet holds it completely. And in that silence, the night began to settle into something that would be remembered differently by everyone who witnessed it, not as a confrontation, not as a spectacle, but as a moment where something unspoken became undeniable, and Adrian stood at the center of that realization, not reclaiming control as he might have before, but acknowledging that control alone had not defined the outcome, that something outside of his authority had shaped the direction of events. And for a man accustomed to commanding every variable, that recognition carried a weight that went beyond the immediate situation. It forced a shift in perspective, a recalibration of what strength truly looked like when it was not tied to position or power. And as his gaze moved once more to Nia, there was no calculation left in it, no strategy, only clarity, the kind that comes when something challenges your understanding and leaves you with no choice but to accept it. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried that clarity without hesitation, not as a declaration meant to impress, but as a statement meant to stand, simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. And though the words themselves were few, they echoed through the room in a way that lingered far beyond their sound, because they did not elevate her above others. They did not place her on a pedestal. They did something far more significant. They recognized her exactly as she was, without diminishing or exaggerating. And in doing so, they restored something that had been quietly denied to her for far too long. And that recognition shifted the atmosphere in a way no action could replicate, because when dignity is acknowledged openly, it reshapes the space around it. It forces everyone present to confront what they had overlooked, what they had accepted without question, and in that confrontation, something changes, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. And for Nia, standing there with the weight of the night settling into something steady within her, those words did not feel like a reward. They did not feel like something given. They felt like something affirmed, something that had always existed but had never been named in a room like this before. And that distinction mattered, because it meant she did not need to carry this moment as an exception. She could carry it as truth, something that would remain long after the memory of this night faded into the background of everyone else's lives. And slowly, the restaurant began to return to motion, not as it had been before, but in a way that reflected what had changed. Conversations resumed in quieter tones, movements became more deliberate, and though the surface appeared to settle, the undercurrent of what had occurred remained, woven into the way people glanced at one another, the way they carried themselves as they prepared to leave, each person taking with them a version of this moment that would shape how they saw the world beyond these walls. And Adrian, after a final pause that held more meaning than any extended speech could offer, stepped back, not away from the moment, but forward into what came next, leaving behind a space that no longer belonged to the old assumptions that had defined it. And Nia, standing where she had once felt the need to disappear, did not move immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that this was the end of something and the beginning of something else, something she did not yet have the words for, but could feel with absolute certainty. And when she finally turned, when she finally stepped away from the center of the room, she did not shrink back into the background. She did not lower her gaze to avoid being seen. She simply walked, steady, grounded, carrying with her a presence that no longer depended on invisibility to survive. And though no one stopped her, no one called her name or asked her to stay, the absence of those things did not diminish what had happened, because the moment had never been about recognition in the conventional sense. It had been about something far more enduring, the quiet, undeniable shift that occurs when someone chooses dignity over fear, action over silence. And in that choice, redefines not only how others see them, but how they see themselves. And as the doors of the restaurant opened and